Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in today. Today we're going to talk about 6 levels of jazz phrases. But before we get started, just wanted to tell you about something that we're really excited to announce. The next virtual jazz workshop will be held in just a few weeks now, and the list of masterclass artists is lined up now, and it is just completely insane. We've got Randy Brecker lined up to do a masterclass, Christian McBride, Jesus Molina, Wycliffe Gordon, Bria Skomberg, Christian Sands, Marquise Hill, Julian Lodge, Terrace Martin, Donnie McCaslin, Gilad Hexelman, Tia Fuller, and there's still more. So just make sure to check out the link at jazzlessonvideos.com/virtual jazz workshop. You can find that in the description of this video here. It's honestly going to be like the craziest few days ever. I'm really excited for it. And if you book now, the full access option will actually include 30 days of unlimited streaming access to all the content as well. The capacity for this is limited and will probably sell out really soon like we have in the past. So just make sure to book now before it's too late. Again, we've got the link in the description, and this week we've also got a coupon code that you can use. Just use code CLB100 and you'll get $100 off the full access option. All right, so let's jump into it now. So for phrase 1, we're gonna check out a diatonic phrase on a dominant chord. This one is going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be a great place to start because we're just going to be using diatonic notes, which just means the notes in the scale. And for a dominant chord, your scale notes can come from the Mixolydian scale, which some people also call the dominant scale. Now, it's important to understand before we go on that understanding scales and understanding the use of scales is just so we can understand the home base of a harmony. So for instance, on a dominant chord, the pianist or guitarist will use the Mixolydian scale as their base to build the chord. When you see a chord symbol, we know it's almost always just classifying the character of the root, third, fifth, and seventh. But in reality, chordal instrumentalists like pianists or guitarists expand on that and add in other degrees from the scale or scales associated with the chord, like the second and the sixth degrees. So for a dominant chord, the Mixolydian scale will fit perfectly, and it will truly outline the full sound implied by a dominant chord. Now, when a lot of developing improvisers think of jazz phrases, a lot of times they think that jazz musicians are just sort of magically adding in all these random notes and somehow it sounds good. Now, oftentimes there are notes being used outside of the harmony or the scale that lines up with the chord, and a lot of times they are being used very masterfully. It's not necessarily just random, but then most of the legends actually did play a lot of material that was just diatonic. So in other words, they would play from chord to chord, and they would play notes that were in the scale matching up with each chord. So just like J.S. Bach used scale notes melodically, so did Dexter Gordon and Charlie Parker. For instance, here's a very famous Charlie Parker lick. And as you can see in this phrase, all the notes lie within the major scale. This is why many of the ebooks that I've written have sections dedicated to phrases using diatonic notes. Just like this first phrase that we're going to start on, which is on a dominant chord, and this is going to be our level 1 jazz phrase. Now you'll notice in this phrase and the Charlie Parker phrase that I just played, every single note from the scale was used. A lot of times what separates more developing players from world-class professionals when it comes to lines that are just using the scale notes is that the world-class pros will construct lines that use actually every single note in the scale that lines up with a chord. That's going to end up sounding a lot better than if you just stab at a few random notes in the scale on the chord. Now, it's important to take a quick step back and remember that when you become fluent in the jazz language, you don't have to think about this stuff as you're playing. It's not like I'm thinking as I'm playing every note that I play, oh, I should make sure that I play this note because it's part of the scale, and I should make sure that I play these 3 notes because that's going to line up well with the chord. These days when I'm playing on a chord, I'm not necessarily thinking about anything. I'm usually just having fun and being in the moment and playing some material that's coming into my head instantaneously. But I'm not thinking about any levels of theory in the moment. However, the practicing that I did to get to this point was very deliberate. And as you're learning the language of this music and becoming more and more fluent, you will notice that more and more you can just be in the moment and you don't have to think about every single note that you're playing. But in the meantime, it does really help to understand how a phrase works and analyze it a bit so you can understand how it functions as you're internalizing it. And then as you become more fluent, you can just have fun and play. So with that in mind, check out how this phrase uses at least 6 of the 7 available scale notes in every single measure of the phrase. Now, you don't necessarily have to think about this super carefully when you're learning to construct lines on your own, but just make sure you're learning good content, and when you're learning some phrases, whether it's from a book or a transcription, just be aware of how a lot of lines are being constructed that way. But as we know, there is more to line construction than just playing the scale notes. So now let's check out a phrase that uses notes outside of the scale, but still in a melodic context. And worth mentioning that a lot of the phrases we're going to check out today come from the Phrases Combo Package at jazzlessonvideos.com. If you do want to download that, it's a great resource for developing your line construction on all sorts of chord progressions using lots of different techniques, a bunch of which we're going to get into now. All right, so let's move on to phrase level 2. So the first thing to consider here on phrase level 2 is we have an actual chord progression here. Instead of just playing a phrase over one chord that sustains, the chords on this phrase are actually changing, hence the expression chord changes. And the set of chord changes here that we're going to look at, they're very common. It's just a major 2-5-1 chord progression, which is like the backbone of jazz. There's also such a thing as a minor 2-5-1 progression. That is just as important to get down, if not more so. It's harder to master. It's got a lot of components to it. We're going to check that out in a bit, so stay tuned. But for now, again, here's a quick overview of a major 2-5-1 progression. So essentially, there's a harmonic system that a lot of chords in any given progression or song will fall into. That system is based on chords that can be built up modally inside of a scale. That's just a fancy way of saying, if we're in a major key looking at the major scale, you can actually build different qualities of chords just using the notes in that scale. So if you want, you could build a minor 7 chord starting from the 2nd degree of the major scale, using every other note. You could also build a dominant 7 chord from the 5th degree of the major scale, just using every other note. When you're using chords from the same harmonic system, they typically sound pretty melodic. For instance, think of the Bill Withers song, Lean on Me, where he just builds chords going up the scale using 1 major, 2 minor, 3 minor, and 4 major. Then he goes back down from there, and that all sounds like this. Now, if you play a 2-5-1 progression, which also just uses harmony inside the same tonal system, that's going to sound like this. Now, there's so much great information that you can learn from studying chord changes more, and it has a truly positive effect on your playing to work on that. There's also a bunch of great tricks that you can do for going about memorizing chord changes, which is why I'll be giving a masterclass specifically on memorizing and playing chord changes at the Virtual Jazz Workshop. So again, definitely make sure to check that out if you want to join us. It's going to be a really crazy few days with tons of information. And again, you're going to have 30 days unlimited streaming access to check out all the content. So the nice thing about playing on chords from the same harmonic system is that each chord scale will have the same notes in it. So for the 2 minor 7 chord, if we're in C major, we would use D Dorian, which is a minor scale with a natural 6, which is commonly used in jazz. Then for the 5 dominant chord, we would use a G dominant scale, also called the Mixolydian scale. And then for the 1 major 7 chord, we would just use the C major scale, which can also be called the Ionian scale. Because all of these scales come from the same harmonic system, they actually all have the same exact notes, just starting from different places. Now, this 2-5-1 progression is so common in jazz, and there's so many ways we can solo on a 2-5-1. That's one of the reasons why I actually made a whole book on phrases over this progression. For instance, we can totally just solo on a major 2-5-1 diatonically, but considering that it would all be notes from the same scale, it sounds really cool if we add in chromatic approach notes and enclosures into the phrase. This is what legends from Sonny Rollins to John Coltrane would do in their solos, and it creates a very cool effect. So here's an example of a phrase using a bunch of chromatic approach note and enclosures as a way of really internalizing this concept. Now, it might seem odd starting this phrase on a D sharp when it's a D minor 7 chord, But this is a great example of seemingly random notes not being random in jazz. So this D sharp is all part of a big 4-note enclosure that lands on the 3rd of the minor 7 chord once you get to beat 3. Then the phrase goes right into another 3-note enclosure landing on the 5th of the G7 chord, which goes straight into another enclosure landing on the 3rd of G7. Then from there we arpeggiate from the 3rd to the 9th of the G7 chord, which goes right into a quick little chromatic approach note, bringing us into the 5th of the C major chord. That 5th becomes part of a 4-note enclosure into the 3rd of the C major chord. Then we play a couple diatonic notes, followed by a chromatic approach note, bringing us into the root of the last measure. From there we play a couple more diatonic notes, and the F natural turns into a 2-note enclosure into the 3rd of the C major 7. And we end by playing the 5th, so we just close off the phrase with a couple of chord tones. All right, so for phrase level 3, we're going to do one more phrase using the major 2-5-1 progression. But this time we're actually going to do a substitution in the second measure. Now as a horn player, I get asked very frequently if it's okay to play a substitution when the rhythm section isn't necessarily going to go with you. And the answer to that is yes, it's absolutely okay. And actually it ends up sounding awesome if you do it well. Sometimes really advanced players will be able to follow you as soon as you do it because they'll hear it. But if they don't, or if you're playing with a more developing rhythm section and they're not able to hear you, it's still gonna sound really great because it's just gonna create some tension and release. So that's what we're gonna do on this phrase when we play a backdoor substitution in measure 2. That's when instead of playing the 5 chord, we play a dominant chord a whole step below the 1 chord, or the tonic. That creates a really cool effect because it changes tensions on the dominant chord and outlines a flat 9, sharp 9, and flat 13, while still keeping the 5th and dominant 7 unchanged. So essentially the chords we're going to outline will sound like this. And if we play a phrase outlining the substitution, while the chordal instrument just plays a regular 2-5-1, it will sound like this. So a backdoor substitution is pretty straightforward. It just creates a moderate amount of tension. It's a really nice effect. And if you want to get even more into substitutions, just check out the ebook Inside Outside Phrases, which is part of that phrases combo package. That's going to have a bunch of content on chordal substitutions, and it's going to give you a bunch of phrases to do a bunch of different chordal substitutions on your horn or whatever instrument you play. All right, so now for phrase level 4, we're going to check out a phrase on a minor 2-5-1 progression, which is very different from a major 2-5-1 progression. Now obviously we play minor chord progressions just as much as we play major chord progressions, but the reality is the minor progressions sometimes are going to be harder because there are a lot of minor 2-5-1s, so it's really important to get this technique down. And because in general minor progressions are so hip, it's going to be really valuable to be able to outline minor 2-5-1 progressions because that's going to be the best place to start. It's also going to sound really cool when you're able to pull it off, because to play through a minor 2-5-1 progression in a way that really embellishes the harmony is going to take being able to play several different scales and understand several different scales that match up with those chords. So the chords in a minor 2-5-1 are 2 half diminished 7, 5-7 flat 9, or an altered chord. We'll talk about that more in a second. And then a minor 7 at the end. So first, let's just understand what all that means. A half diminished chord has a lowered 3rd, 5th, and 7th. So from C, it would end up being C, E flat, G flat, and B flat. Now what's interesting about the half diminished chord is there are 2 scale options that you can use on it, and it's really a matter of dealer's choice. You can use one or the other, or you can even use both in a single phrase. It's all fair game. Now the first option on this half diminished chord is just going to be the Locrian scale. That's the 7th mode of the major scale, but don't worry about modes right now. The important thing is just to understand how the scale works from its own root. So with the Locrian scale, you pretty much lower everything. You'll have a lowered 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 7th. So from C, you'll have C, D flat, E flat, F, G flat, A flat, and B flat. Now the other option for this chord is just to make one small adjustment and change the 2nd degree so it's natural. Then you'll have what's logically called a Locrian natural 2 scale. This would be the 6th mode of melodic minor, but again, The important thing is just to know how the scale works from its own root. Now we could really spend all day just talking about more things to consider with the voice leading of these chords and all sorts of stuff with chord changes in general, and especially on the minor 251s. So just make sure to check out at the Virtual Jazz Workshop. I will be giving that masterclass on playing chord changes and tricks for memorizing chord changes. That's going to be something that's going to be really valuable to check out. And it will just be an opportunity to get a little deeper into these topics. But for now, let's just move on to the 5 chord. There are actually 3 options you can use on a 5/7 flat 9, and for sake of brevity here, I'll just say that they're all great. They're all worth trying, and it doesn't matter if you're outlining the exact same version of the 5/7 chord that the chordal instrument is playing. These options are all pretty much interchangeable. So one is going to be a half-whole diminished scale. Another will be an altered scale, and the last option is a Phrygian dominant scale. These all just provide different combinations of alterations on the 5 chord. Then finally, when we get to the 1, it's just a minor chord. So usually you'll want to play Dorian minor, but you can also play melodic minor, where you just raise the 7. So let's go back to a phrase using just the scale notes here. But this phrase is going to sound really different from the diatonic phrase on the major 251, because now we're going to be using 3 different scales in one phrase. That phrase uses a nice combination of scales because check out how from one scale to the next, only one note changes. So if you were to check out each scale starting at the same point, that's going to become very clear to see. If you want to get into all the options for minor 251 chords and a bunch of different phrases that use the different combinations, you can check that out in the PDF 75 phrases on minor progressions. All right, so for phrase level 5, we're going to get into some pentatonic shifting here. And pentatonic shifting is when you use pentatonics to shift in and out of different tonalities. And in this phrase, we actually use a couple different ways of shifting. So there are 2 primary methods that I suggest using for getting into pentatonic shifting, and both of these methods I get really deep into in the Pentatonics Masterclass that we released on Jazz Lesson videos. There are also a bunch of examples of phrases using pentatonic shifting in the 1 chord vamps phrases PDF, which is also in the phrases combo package, and we're going to check out a phrase from that ebook now. And in this phrase, we actually use both of those methods of shifting in the same phrase. Those methods are shifting with a common tone and shifting through different tonalities using voice leading to the closest degree. So the latter is just a fancy way of saying, at the end of each measure, find the closest note above or below that will bring you into a new tonality. So at the end of measure 1 here, we want to shift into B minor, and our last note was a B flat from a C minor pentatonic scale. So what we can do is just go down to an A, which is the 5th degree of the B minor pentatonic scale, or you can think about it as the 7th of B minor 7, either way. Then in the next measure, we shift using a common tone. So if you look at the downbeat of measure 3, we play a B coming from the B minor pentatonic scale. And then we use that as a pivot note to shift into the F sharp minor pentatonic scale, which is another pentatonic scale that contains the note B. Then into measure 4, you can see we use that voice leading concept again to get us back into C minor, which is just where we started. And you'll see here from measure to measure, we're just using a cool mix of pentatonic shapes and patterns. Pentatonic shifting is really effective to use when you're vamping on 1 chord, which is what we do here. And that's one of the reasons why there are a bunch of phrases using pentatonic shifting in the 1 chord vamp phrases PDF. You can also get deeper into the concept of pentatonics and pentatonic shifting through the Pentatonic Combo Package, which has a full masterclass on this topic, plus an ebook on pentatonic patterns for improvisation. All right, so for phrase level 6, we're going all out here. We're going back to a simple major 251 chord progression, but the phrase content is going to be pretty insane. So essentially here we do a bunch of melodic cell content in the beginning and end of the phrase, and on the inside of the phrase we do what's called triadic shifting. Triadic shifting is a similar concept to pentatonic shifting, where you're shifting into different tonalities, but it can happen a lot faster, so it ends up sounding really intense. The melodic cells concept is hard when it's fast like this, but this is actually a really accessible concept that you can get into for playing lines that sound more modern. So to wrap up here, I'll just attempt to play this pretty crazy line and we'll see if you dig it. Alright guys, so we covered a bunch of territory today. Again, make sure to check out that phrases combo package for a really awesome resource on so many different concepts for your line construction and phrase development. And definitely make sure to book access to the virtual jazz workshop now before it sells out. We're really excited for it, and I know it's going to be a really inspiring experience for everyone who's there with us. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. As always, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Give this video a like, and I'll see you next time.